The BC government recently passed the Short-Term Rental Accommodations Act, and the idea of this act is to give municipalities and districts bigger teeth when dealing with short-term rentals. Essentially, it's a ban on short-term rentals in big cities. Let's talk about it, and I've got all the details so you are informed. If you are thinking of doing a short-term rental, an Airbnb as an investment property, you still can, and I've got the information for you. Let's break it down. This came to fruition because the BC government realized that there is a housing shortage and 16,000 units have been used for short-term rentals. And the government's idea is to get those units back into the pool for rentals. Let me kind of break down why I think that's not going to happen, but let's get into it. The purpose of the act is to give local governments stronger tools to enforce short-term rental bylaws and to return short-term rental units to long-term housing market and to establish the new provincial role in the regulation of short-term rentals. So up until now, it's been purely municipalities that have been dealing with short-term rentals in the form of bylaws. But the province is now establishing its role, and so it's going to have larger teeth for the municipalities and districts. So they are talking about Airbnbs, Vrbo, Expedia, Flipkey, Facebook Marketplace, Kijiji, Craigslist, and even newspaper ads are all going to be regulated from the BC government. Now, there are a few exemptions for land that the BC government is not worried about. Reserve land, treaty land, hotels, motels, any vehicle such as an RV or like a tent or temporary shelter like a yurt. So this is only for permanent structure. Districts are going to get a large upgrade from $2,000 in fines. Now they can have up to $50,000 in fines. And regional districts will now be able to regulate licenses for short-term rentals. And effective May 1st, short-term rental hosts will be required to display valid business licenses on their listings in areas where businesses licenses are required. Of course, there are going to be some exemptions. You can rent out your primary residence. That's not a problem. You can also rent out a secondary suite on your residence. Think guest home, coach home, secondary suite, basement suite. That's not a problem. You're still able to do that. By late 2024 and early 2025, there's going to be a registry for all short-term rentals. And then later, the province is going to establish a task force that is going to oversee tracking compliance, issuing orders, and administering penalties and violations. Think mall cops, glorified bylaw officers. Now, this isn't affecting all communities. This is only affecting municipalities with a population of 10,000 or more, or within 15 kilometers of those municipalities. So think basically every major city is now banned from having an Airbnb unless you're renting out a suite on your property or your primary residence. There is an opt-out option. Some municipalities are very against this type of legislation. They want Airbnbs in their community, and for multiple reasons, and we'll get into that later. If the municipality that is over 10,000 people, population in the area, if they have a vacancy rate of 3% or less for 2 consecutive years, they can opt out of these new regulations. Now, obviously, exemptions are going to be certain, strata property guest suites, obviously hotels and motels, as I've mentioned, home exchange programs, fractional ownership, or like hunting, fishing, water sport lodges, things of that nature. And again, municipalities with a population of 10,000 or less and not within 15 kilometers of a larger municipality are still allowed to have Airbnbs. All mountain resorts are going to be pretty much exempt, so you can still rent out at Silver Star, Apex, Big White, you name it, you can still rent them out. There are going to be quite a few municipalities that you're still allowed to rent out places. Now, some municipalities are going to opt in. Tofino is one of the first municipalities that have opted into the program, and they want the restrictions in their area. So they are now having rental restrictions in Tofino. I know Eucalypt is also looking to see what happens in Tofino, and they'll probably opt in as well. So we'll see what happens to Eucalypt next. So yeah, interesting to see what happens in BC with short-term rentals. You can still have a short-term rental if you're wanting to do a Airbnb. You still can. Obviously, like a lakeside cabin in a small community is no problem. Mountain resorts, no problem. The only thing you have to watch for is a large city. If you were going to do one in like Vernon, or if you were going to do one in Kelowna or West Kelowna, those are going to be now out. However, if you're living in those communities and you want to rent out a suite or be in the suite and rent out your the main house, you're allowed to do that. So there's still going to be some Airbnbs available, but not as much. Now, I know the province said there was 16,000 units that are trying to get back into the rental pool, but this doesn't necessarily mean that they're going to go back into the rental pool. Remember, a lot of the landlords that bought these places did their numbers based on what kind of income they would make on an Airbnb, which can be higher than a long-term renter. So some of those owners are going to be forced to sell, and that doesn't mean that's going back into the rental pool, though an end user will likely buy it and use it, which is great. We don't have enough inventory in the resale market, but trying to increase the rental pool, this isn't necessarily going to help. And I know there's not a ton of units that are being used for Airbnbs. I know it says it's 16,000. I haven't seen those numbers. I'd like to see where they got those numbers from. But this is going to have a negative effect in a lot of areas. Think Vancouver's movie industry. A lot of the times people like filming, production companies like filming in Vancouver because the cost is lower. Now they're going to have to put crew members and cast into hotels instead of short-term Airbnbs, and this will drive the price of production higher. Unfortunately, this will probably put some productions into that were going to be in Vancouver into Toronto, or they'll stay in America. So this is an unfortunate thing for the movie industry in Vancouver. Think of small communities like Prince George. Prince George voted unanimously to leave the rules, but unfortunately their vacancy rate is less than 3%, so they cannot leave. But they have a needs in health services. So they have nurses that'll come up on temporary contracts, and they would work there for a temporary time. Now they'll have to stay in a hotel, which will be more expensive, so they'll have a harder time getting nurses into their area. So that is an unfortunate thing as well. There's going to be a lot of little nuanced things that are going to come out of this that people didn't really realize when they passed this law. Is this going to affect the housing market enough? I don't think so. The housing market is a multifaceted problem, and we're going to need a multifaceted solution to really solve the housing crisis in BC. This is one small step in that direction. I don't think it's really the long-term answer, but again, a lot of the smaller communities, you're still allowed to have those Airbnbs, and again, you can rent out your basement or guest suite and stuff like that, so it's not really the end of the world. But that is the regulations now for BC's short-term rental market. They've got some big teeth, some fines in the districts up to $50,000, and from $1,000 to $3,000 per day for municipalities for anyone that's caught breaking the rules. So now that they have a registry and then an enforcement agency that'll be enforcing these rules, this is going to be something that sticks, and it's not going to be an easy way to get around it. And like I said, they'll be looking at newspapers, Craigslist ads, Airbnb, and they're going to find you if you're looking at doing this below the table, because they're going to look at all those newspapers and everything else. So that's my take on the rental restrictions, the short-term rental restrictions in BC. If you have any questions, comments, please reach out. I am happy to help.